episode of this year's Beetlegust. If you've never heard of Beetlegust, that is Beetlejuice themed videos all August long. And a lot of times we go into the next month as well, which I think we will on this project because things are taking me a little while to get through. In this video, I am working on worms and rocks, so very exciting. Specifically, I am working on sandworms, which we see in the Saturn scene in the original Beetlejuice movie. They're also in the second movie, but they say they're on Titan, Saturn's moon. But anyway, there are sandworms, and there are rocks, and there's a lot of sand. I mentioned these briefly in the previous video, but I 3D printed these sandworms, which were designed by Elise from Elise Little Things. I asked her to help me with this project because I knew I wanted quite a few sandworms kind of moving around in the sand, and I knew sculpting them would take me forever. Thank you so much, Elise, for helping me with these sandworms. The design is wonderful. She started with a 3D scan of my original sculpted sandworm, and then she added some of her own artistic details and flair, which I love. It made them a little spookier than my original sandworm, which is perfect for this scene. I will link Elise's channel down below. Please go check out her channel if you have interest in 3D printing, 3D sculpting. She does amazing work. And if you feel like you've heard her name before here on Bentley House Minis, that's because she helped me with the bathroom. She has these beautifully sculpted bathroom fixtures. They were perfect for the Beetlejuice bathroom, and I'm so thankful that I can continue to use some of her wonderful designs in my project. I do not believe she will be selling the sandworms because they are Beetlejuice intellectual property, so I'm very thankful that she did something special for me. Thank you, Elise. I appreciate it so, so much. I did print these with a filament printer instead of a resin printer. Resin typically gives you more detail, but filament is much lighter weight. These are very lightweight, very durable, and because they're going to be sticking straight out of sand, I didn't want them to be heavy and feel like they could possibly fall over and break. But that means I have quite a bit of cleanup to do before I can even get started painting. So let's do that now. We had to use some really strong supports on these prints so that the filament printer could get all of the details in the teeth without the print failing. We tried to use some lighter supports at first, but then we had a few failures in the prints. So it was just better to clean it up afterwards and not have to fight the printer so much. I'm using some flush cutters to try and cut off any of the extra as close to the surface of the sandworm as possible, but ultimately I will just have to face them in a direction where you don't see a lot of the printer mess that's on the back. I'm going to sand them as flat as I can, but ultimately I think they came out really well, and I'm still happy with my choice to print them in filament so that they aren't just super heavy with the resin print and just constantly falling over. So they are still going to fall a little bit. I tried to see if I could just use masking tape to tape the bottom of it to the floor, but I did need a little bit of support because it is top heavy. And now that I have the sandworms free from their printer supports, I can start to lay out the scene. And this is almost like sketching. If you were creating a drawing or a painting, you do like try to sketch out all the elements. So now this is my sketch, but it's in 3D. I had this one piece that was a printer fail. It just didn't work out, and I was like, oh, this could actually be an extension on the tail. And then I also think I want to create one of the heads where it's almost like underneath the sand, so I'm going to have to cut one in the end. But I showed this to my members and my patrons, and someone suggested that I should make the head taller than the tail. And so I moved my little support over to underneath the head, and I think that's much more intimidating to have the head up high. The other advice I got was that it's kind of hard to know where the sandworms need to be until the rocks are made. So I'm going to be using this foam clay that was given to me by my friend She. Thank you, She. And I'm going to be creating the rocks, at least a practice rock to see how big they are, how they look in the scene, how they impact the sandworms. I have never used foam clay before, but I have seen some other creatives use this clay, and I thought it would be a good one for this, especially since I'm trying to keep things lightweight. I started with some aluminum foil and just put it into a weird rock formation, and then I hardened it by adding some hot glue on both sides. This will just help it keep its shape. The clay that I have is just a mixture of several different colors. I don't just like have a big bucket of red clay, which red is the color that the rocks are supposed to be. So I decided to mix some together, and I will end up painting them in the end, but it's kind of nice to have the correct color base coat already on the rocks. I'm adding the clay slowly to the aluminum foil, and it was so easy to work with. I really felt like I was almost sculpting with a cloud, maybe a little denser than a cloud, but it was fun to work with and extremely lightweight. I added a few bumps here and there, and then I used a little bit of water to smooth it out. Not too smooth, you know, because it's a rock, but smooth it out mostly so it looked like all one piece and not like bits of clay that were added together. This was my initial test rock, so I wanted to make sure it dried completely before I just said, yes, this is the way I'm going, and made a ton of them. So once it was dry, I could add it into my scene, and I could really see that advice was correct. These are going to take up a lot of space. Now, I do plan to add the biggest rocks up against the side walls, against the mural that I painted in the previous video. So these are going to be a little bit out of the way, but they still, I mean, it's a lot going on in one space. So I am going to go ahead and continue to work on the rocks to make sure that I don't plan something that's a little bit too much. I am also starting to notice that the new height on that very tall sandworm may obstruct some of the lighting that I was planning, so I did move it over to the center a bit more. This is where all the planning comes in, to try and get something that actually works once we get to the final scene. I carefully pulled my aluminum foil shapes out of my space and started the same steps all over again that I did for my practice rock. I added some colors together, this time several colors, because I knew I had a lot of aluminum foil to cover. And this did add a lot of bulk. And they just kept feeling like they were getting bigger and bigger, and I couldn't help but think they also looked like little piles of chewed bubble gum. Probably because of the color. It's kind of like a light pink, and they look very gummy. And that's all I could think while I was sculpting these. I was sculpting with chewing gum. Anyway, moving on. I sculpted the two largest rocks against the wax paper on my desktop because these are going flat up against the wall, against the mural. And as you can see, they are just plain aluminum foil on the back. Although I did try to make it, like, sculpt it so there was a natural curve to them as the clay went around the aluminum foil. Now it's time to put them back into the scene, and as you can see, they're huge. And I started to think they look like Play-Doh, so we've got chewing gum, we've got Play-Doh. All of these are things I don't want people to think when they're looking into my scene. So we have to make some adjustments. Going back to the reference from the original movie, I realized that the rocks are a lot more irregularly shaped, and they're thinner in places and then thicker in other places. It looks like maybe meteors or windstorms, maybe sandworms have bumped into them and created chunks that have come out of them. So instead of keeping them one solid tubular thickness around the aluminum foil, I decided to cut into these pieces, and the foam clay made that incredibly easy. The original rock had dried so much that when I cut into it and revealed the interior foil, I had to add a little bit of clay back to it to smooth over that area. However, on some of the more recent rock forms that I created, the foam clay was still wet enough underneath the surface that I could just use the clay that was under the surface to cover up the foil. There are just like a few little places where you can see the foil sticking out, but everything will be painted in the end, so I'm not worrying about those few little dots. After the big craters were cut into the rock formations, I used my flush cutters to just cut a few more little pieces that really make it look like a rough rock. And they're looking so much worse, but by looking worse, they're looking better. So it's been a process of just kind of seeing the reference, seeing what's missing or figuring out why it's not working, and then making an adjustment. While the rocks were drying, I decided to permanently attach the sandworm head extension. I had temporarily taped these two pieces together to figure out the shape that I liked for the sandworm head, and now that I'm taking it apart, I'm marking it with a Sharpie so I can re-put them back together and know that when I put it back in my scene, I'm not going to be frustrated that it's going in the wrong direction. I thought a lot about how to make this a strong connection between the two pieces because it is going to be sticking up in my scene, and I really don't want to reach my hand in there one day and accidentally break this piece apart. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting into the two flat sides of these pieces so that they're next to each other. So when I line everything up, there are these two cuts or these two inserts into the pieces. And I could have done more after I did this. I was like, I should have done more of those. I don't know why I only did two. But I'm going to initially stick them together with a combination of super glue on one side, gel super glue, and then on the other side I'm putting wood glue. And whenever you use super glue with any type of PVA glue, there's an almost instant bond, so you don't have to sit there and just hold it until the glue dries. So I do have a little bit of time to adjust things, but as you can see, it pretty much takes hold. I didn't clip this at all. This is real time of me gluing it together and the glue taking hold. I am going to let that dry for a while before I do the next step, so I'm adding on my masking tape again just to make sure it won't come apart while it dries. To finish up my very strong connection, I am going to be using epoxy sculpt. This is a two-part clay that has a chemical reaction whenever you put it together. That's why I'm wearing gloves to use it. I'm mixing the two parts, and as it cures over the next 24 hours, it's going to become rock hard. So I'm using this at the joint where the sandworm pieces come together. My plan is to sculpt it flush so you can't tell that there's any clay added there. But first I'm going to smush a bunch of this epoxy sculpt into the little cuts that I created, and this is going to force some of the epoxy sculpt into the hollow body of the sandworm, hopefully creating something like a clamp that's clamping these two pieces together. That's at least what's happening in my mind. After I have those initial pieces added, I'm going to use a sculpting tool to push it flat against the body of the sandworm, and then I'm using a little bit of water on my finger to rub over the top of it, and hopefully this will create a seamless connection, and once it's painted you won't be able to tell that these were two different pieces. Now, a tip I give with epoxy sculpt, because I always make too much, is after I am done sculpting, I roll it into a ball. Later I can test if the epoxy sculpt is hard enough for me to work with it, and also you have an extra sphere for crafting later. I will let you know that this past week has been one of the busiest weeks of my life. Just everything seemed to land on the week that also happened to be the first week of school and the week of just everything happening. So it was a very busy week, and I didn't get as far painting these sandworms as I wanted to, and so I was thinking, what about a live stream? To be honest, I was putting off painting these sandworms just because they are so incredibly detailed and I knew how long it would take me. So I figured a live stream is the perfect way to get started on this project because I have people sitting and talking with me and just kind of keeping me company as I get started on the very tiny details. I will put in a few clips from the live stream. However, if you want to see the whole thing and the entire painstakingly slow process, I will link the live stream down below in the description box. And I do like live streams every now and then because it does show you just how long things take. Whereas an edited video like this, it seems like, oh, just 30 minutes, you can throw that together, when in reality it takes much, much, much longer. I started out the stream painting the inner gums because the area that is a connection between the head, the outer head, and the inner head is the most complicated part of the sandworm, most complicated to sculpt and paint. What order do I paint all of this? Because everything gets really, really close together with the head within a head. So I did the gums first, and then I think I need to paint the white of the inner head, And then I can do the lips and the teeth. This is gonna take me a while. Working on these lips and gums. I have one more, I gotta finish up the other side. Off screen, wrong, Ara, wrong. You're off screen. Almost off screen again. Try one more time. As you can see, I had a hard time keeping my work on screen for the duration of the stream, but after about an hour and a half when we wrapped up, this is where I had gotten to. So I had all of the inner gums painted, the lips were painted, and one side of one worm I had started the stripes on the teeth. After the stream, I was feeling much more motivated. I feel like I had gotten past some of the toughest parts. One of the toughest parts just being starting on a project that you know will take a long time. At least that's the way it is for me. But then I continued with striping the rest of the teeth and then moving on to the tongue. I first laid down a base coat of white paint and then added the stripes similar to the way I did the teeth. I do think it's the black and white striping that starts to bring these into the Beetlejuice world. I mean, obviously they're sculpted in the shape of sandworms, but just the gums and the lips were very pastel, and I was like, I don't know if it's too light, but when I started adding the black and white, I was like, okay, here we go. The inner head needed a yellow eye, so I started by painting the eye yellow, and then I added a pupil of red and black on top of that. It's a little difficult to see because whenever I'm working on the inner head, there is a giant row of teeth in the way. And I think I'm finally done working on the inside of the mouth, so I decided to move on to the exterior, which is going to be much easier to paint because it's just easier to get to. However, it's still going to take me a while because it's a larger surface that I need to paint. And through all of this, in case you're wondering, I am using both Warhammer and Vallejo paint, and I needed something that was just a really good set of paints to work with this. It made this process faster than it could have been. It could have been much slower if I was having to do multiple coats of paint. I decided to paint the white stripes separately so I didn't waste some of this paint because it is a more expensive paint. So I did the black stripes first, and then I am painting white over the white 3D printed sandworm. This helped me straighten up some of my black painted lines, and then it also covered the joint that I had previously made with epoxy sculpt on my really tall sandworm. This next detail is my favorite, and I feel like it's what brings all of this together. It is finally painting the exterior eyeball red. And I don't actually know if it's a real eye, or you know how some animals in the wild have adapted things that look like fake eyes so that other animals will attack those areas, but it's not their real eyes? So I don't know, are these real eyes, or is it just like a fake exterior? Let me know your sandworm theories in the comments. I had this wash in my army painter set of paints that I was using, and I was like, maybe I can just use this wash straight out of the bottle. So I decided to use it on the sandworm that I'm going to be cutting down anyway, and it was just a little bit too dark, and I'd rather start light and build up a wash rather than start out too dark and not like it, especially after all of that paint work. So I mixed some water and the wash from the bottle. It did say it was a water-based wash, and I liked that level of grunge much better. I felt like it was a little bit more controllable on my end, and I felt like it wasn't just taking over all of the black and white paint that I just finished painting. I did the same wash on each sandworm. I didn't want them to look too bright and shiny and new, but I also did not want to take away from the striking black and white stripes. So I didn't want it to be like black and brown stripes when they're supposed to be black and white, but I do think it makes them look like they are animals that have been going in and out of the ground and have a little bit of grunge on them. So here you can see the difference between a sandworm that's had the wash added and one that hasn't had the wash added yet. So I'm pretty happy with this result, and I did end up doing 2 layers of the wash. As I said, I would rather start light and build it up rather than start too dark and then feel like I have to repaint my worms all over again. I did realize I missed a detail on the inner heads. They have some little red speckles on their nose. So on my practice worm, I did some large speckles that I didn't like. So then on another worm, I did some smaller speckles. It almost looked like freckles. And so here you can see the difference. And I ended up going with the smaller speckles for the worms that you will actually see their heads. I also realized on my original sandworm I did the black circles around their eyes, so I added those as well with some chalk pastel. My final step on the worms is going to be adding some gloss varnish over the eyeballs and a little bit over the teeth and gums. I think this is going to make them look even more fierce, especially when we get the lights in there and those teeth and eyes are shining back at you as you're looking into the scene. So I'm going to allow the sandworms to dry, and yes, we still have to paint the rocks. They have been drying for a couple days now, and they're a lot more solid, and I did immediately break one. But thankfully, rocks get cracks in them, so I don't feel like I have to fix that or redo any of that. But I did realize, okay, the foam clay is going to be a little bit delicate. Thankfully, these pieces are going to be glued up against the wall, so they will have some support. I did a base coat of some red craft paint, and then I'm going to go over everything with a bit of Mod Podge. This is just going to seal the paint against the foam clay and hopefully continue to strengthen the foam clay itself. I wanted to add a light brushing of the same orange that I used in the orange moon that's up on the mural. I'm constantly trying to figure out ways that I can blend these items together within the scene, give them some similar highlights, some similar colors, so it looks like they really blend together as an entire world. In the same mindset, I decided to use the exact same wash I used on the worms on the rocks. And because of all the pits and craters that I created with my flush cutters, when I just really wasn't liking the rocks at the beginning, all of this wash is really going to get into those, and it's going to give it this really cool texture. Now at this point I realized they were a bit too shiny. Matte Mod Podge is not matte, by the way, so I did a spray of a matte clear coat, and this is how it came out. You can kind of see the difference between the shiny side and the matte side, and I think this is going to look much better on a dusty, very dusty scene on Saturn. Now that we have the sandworms painted, we have the rocks painted, let's put it all together again inside of the Beetlejuice base, which is right underneath where I'm talking. And you will notice that I've gone back and forth several times putting these pieces into the scene. And that's because even though the scene has just a few elements, there's sandworms, sand, rocks, and a door, it's also incredibly complicated. They all have to work together in harmony. So that's why I keep going back and forth between the scene and then working on the individual pieces to make sure that they work. Immediately, I was so happy that I added that little dusting of orange. I think it really works with that moon up in the left corner. Thankfully, I had just left my masking tape supports on the floor of the space so I could add my sandworms in where I wanted them to go pretty easily. The rocks, I'm still kind of moving around and figuring out what I want, but I'm pretty set on this look at the moment, although when I start adding the sand and permanently putting these guys in place, things might change. So now onto that worm that I kept saying was going to get cut in half. I think it's about time to do that. He is fully painted. I want him to kind of be peeking out of the sand like he's about to come out of the sand and cause some problems. Now I had some issues trying to figure out what in the world I was going to cut this sandworm with. It would have been good to just printed the head by itself, but that's not what we did. And anything I do cut off is going to be going in my recycle bin, so you may see part of a sandworm in some future build. I had a moment where I thought I might use my flush cutters to cut through these, and then I quickly realized that's not going to happen. Okay, so what do you think?
Yeah, probably that side, yeah.
That side? And so you want me to hold it like that? We have a sandworm diving into the sand.
Yeah, that turned out pretty well.
Other facial features.
You know, you could have done a better job painting the inside of the teeth.
After I fake punched Mr. Technology for his sassy comment, I was able to add our sandworm back into the scene. Of course, there's going to be mounds of sand everywhere, kind of covering up the sides, so the fact that it's a little choppy on the edges, no one will ever know unless they watched this video, or maybe the sand video as well. But I'm very happy with this. I am so excited for the next steps coming up because we're getting closer and closer. I feel like the pieces are finally coming together. I think the sandworms look good, like they've been kind of in and out of the soil. They're not too crisp and clean. All that's left now is the mirrored hallway, which I spoke about in the previous video, and then everything needs to be covered in sand. So in the next video, I will at least be doing the hallway. Trying not to flash you with the mirror here. I did settle on the mirror that I am going to use, so I have that in. I'm all ready to go with the hallway. I do want to put lighting in the hallway as well, so I need to think about that. Still a little bit more planning to do, but I do have all the materials I need, so I'm excited to get started. And then if that goes really smoothly and quickly, I will start on the sand part of the project as well. That is my current plan at this time. Big thank you again to Elise for helping me with these sandworms. You are the artist that saved Beetlejuice. You know, instead of the Grinch that stole Christmas, the artist that saved Beetlejuice. Please go tell her thank you for helping me. Because honestly, it wouldn't be happening without her, so thank you, Elise. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Happy Beetlejuice. Thank you for sticking around and hanging in there with me as I slowly work through this project. I'm so excited to start to see it all come together. Have a fabulous Beetlejuice week. Bye. Specifically, I am working on sandworms. Specifically, why can't I say specifically? Specifically, I am working on sandworms from the Saturn Specific and Saturn should not be in the same sentence. Specifically, sandworms on Saturn.